There's going to be an advertisement bouncing around all forms of media, including social media, from the Heritage Foundation, directed at Washington, D.C., and saying we should no longer be spending no strings attached money in Ukraine without any end in sight. Take a listen to what Heritage is now running.
Congress is considering a proposal to send even more of your hard-earned money to Ukraine. And here's the worst part. They're holding hostage disaster relief money for Americans until they get their way. That's just plain wrong. Your family's contribution already totals roughly $900 for Ukraine. Until Joe Biden offers a plan to end the war, Congress shouldn't approve another cent. The Heritage Foundation is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
Quite a number, $900 per household already spent on Ukraine. Let's talk about this subject with Dr. Kevin Roberts. He's the president of the Heritage Foundation and the host of the Kevin Roberts Show, and he joins us on the phone. Hello, sir.
Hey, Vince, it's always great to be with you. I'm here in Milwaukee. We'll be watching the debate firsthand, advocating for good conservative policies and ideas, including no longer sending blank checks to Ukraine.
Yeah, no longer sending blank. And that seems to be an important, you emphasize that it's a blank check. That seems to be an important distinction about what you're talking about, because I noticed that there's some criticism of you right now saying, he's saying we shouldn't send any more money whatsoever for any reason. What I hear you saying, and you can say it yourself, is that you would like an understanding of what this money is being spent on and what the goal is.
That's exactly right. And I and my colleagues at Heritage have been consistent on this for 2 years. We actually argued for a small military aid package to go to Ukraine before the invasion as a matter of deterrence. We were consistent, therefore, when the first package that came up 15 months ago was not, as you and your audience remember, focused solely on military aid. A lot of it had some Pelosi social justice programs in it. So on those grounds, but most of all, especially relevant to today's debate, on the grounds of the President of the United States not telling us what the strategy is, what the end game is, what the money is going to be being used for, and also what the accountability is. There's just no transparency on this money. You can believe all of those things as we do, Vince, believe that there's a real problem there, and also hope with every fiber of our being that the Ukrainians pull this off.
Well, so much for defending democracy. They don't seem all that interested in getting the American public's buy-in on this very expensive venture, because this is one of those issues, Dr. Kevin Roberts, where I've noticed they've never tried to convince the public of the rightness of this position. They've never attempted to get our buy-in whatsoever. They've never told us how the money is being used. They've never promised that they're going to keep it accountable. And they just expect us to keep going along with it without any explanation whatsoever. How is that democracy?
Well, that's exactly right. And it's a source of extreme frustration, not just for those of us who are conservatives, but increasingly, if you look at Fox's recent poll on this, in a recent CNN poll as well, in every demographic group in the center, young people, older voters, and now increasingly the president's own base. And so if we had a magic wand, we would have sent $10 billion of military aid, roughly speaking, well before the invasion, only military aid to deter it. I think that would have been successful. Biden didn't listen. Now we're 16 months into this thing, and ultimately where we are today on the ground in Ukraine, unfortunately, tragically,
yes,
is a stalemate at best. And so the President of the United States, more than ever, has the moral obligation to the American people to say, amid this war of attrition, amid this war that is nothing more, nothing better than a stalemate, unfortunately, what's this money going to be used for, and where is the end in sight, especially considering all of the priorities we have here at home, including natural disasters.
And calling it a stalemate may actually be generous, unfortunately, because we keep seeing, to the extent that any actual information can break through, indications that the so-called Ukrainian counteroffensive that we're paying for is faltering in a big way. In the New York Times this week, they say that the Biden administration is frustrated that the Ukrainians are sending people to the wrong places, that they're sending arms to the wrong places, and then as a result, Russia is able to take advantage of all of this. Additionally, I keep seeing headlines that our stockpiles are running thin and bare. Obviously, that works to the advantage of our own defense industry, who like those headlines so they can sell more things. But that does concern me when it comes to our own security, that we're sending so many arms over to Ukraine at the expense of some of our own security concerns, no?
Well, you make two excellent points there. I'll start with the supply issue. 6 or 7 months ago, when at Heritage we started saying this is a real problem, these diminishing supplies that we probably need to defend ourselves, and we certainly need to stockpile to defend the Taiwanese in the case of an invasion by China. People, the same naysayers today who are very loud, the same neocons were saying, oh, you got to be wrong. And then they had to admit that we were right. And then on the second point of the stalemate, well, I wish the Ukrainians on the first day had pushed the Russians out of Ukraine. The reality is we probably are being generous in calling it a stalemate. 6 months ago, I did an interview and I said, look, I'm pulling for the Ukrainians. All of us at Heritage are, but it just doesn't look to us like this is going to be successful. Of course, the same neocon naysayers said, you're wrong. Well, our own Pentagon, which has been really slow to be transparent about this issue, is the source of information to President Biden that this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians isn't going well. All of that points to this, Vince. The President of the United States, every single time that we are sending the taxpayers' hard-earned precious tax dollars abroad, has a moral obligation to tell us why, has a moral obligation to tell us what the end game is. It's especially the case now, and the fact that there are so many people only in D.C. who are babbling about all of the problems with our position suggests that we're completely over the target, and we're going to stay there until we get answers.
But as you and I are speaking, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Elizabeth Warren have just all traveled to Kiev today. They're all meeting in Ukraine once again to make big promises of a lot more money and a lot more materiel to flow in their direction. Do you think Washington is taking your urging and the urging of, as you point out, 55% of the American people seriously?
No, Washington isn't, although there is a growing number of members, both in the House and the Senate, who are, and thank goodness for the courage of those elected officials who've taken some hard votes. But it's no surprise to your audience that the establishment in Washington is not. They hate the fact that the Heritage Foundation is not saluting and getting in line, but both because we love the truth and we believe at Heritage we have an obligation to tell the truth even when it hurts, and because we know that a majority of the American people across the political spectrum are increasingly frustrated with this situation, I actually think we're going to prevail on this next vote.
Tell me, obviously this is the circle you run in now. You're the president of the Heritage Foundation. You're very familiar with all the various conservative organizations and allied groups. Not everybody has the same position on this subject. What kind of debate are you hearing? What kind of aggression is directed at Heritage right now for you taking such a public position of responsibility on Ukraine funding?
Well, for the most part, it's disbelief that because we are an organization that believes that America ought to be a leader in the world and that our military ought to be strong, that somehow believing that ought to lead us to accepting these multiple blank checks to Ukraine. And obviously, those two things are not logically consistent, but most of it is a lot of bluster. And you know, as you know, Vince, you've gotten to know me. I don't get into imputing motives, but what I can tell you, the motive of the Heritage Foundation is that we are not bought off by official Washington. We are not bought off by K Street lobbyists. We are the people's advocates behind enemy lines inside the imperial city of Washington, D.C. And we can both have a very strong America as well as have that strong America ask really tough questions about a preposterous policy.
Do you get annoyed at all by the juvenile descriptions of the stakes in Ukraine? Like, throughout over the last year or so, people telling us, well, it's just a war for democracy, and that you've got, it's Churchill and Hitler and all sorts of stuff. It's like it's kind of crazy, actually, the way it's described, and then acting as if there is no corruption in Ukraine to be concerned about. The prevailing narratives are basically to treat all of the rest of us like idiots and children.
Well, it's really true, and they believe that they can bully us, even the Heritage Foundation, into that. And you know that I spent a lot of years in the classroom, and I would have given an F to a lot of these people, all of whom happen to be based in Washington, interestingly, because of their rhetoric, their lack of logic. Look, I have no problem that there's a difference of opinion on this on the political right. I actually think a healthy debate is good. Just yesterday, I had a really friendly, healthy difference of opinion with one of our friends who's at another think tank. That's the model for rhetoric, and I applaud her, who happens to be a Heritage alum, for this. But to say that we can't even ask the question, to make the charge that somehow we want Russia to win just because we're asking these hard questions, tells me that the other side actually doesn't have a really good argument.
Yeah, exactly. It points to the weakness of your debate. If you say something that's stupid and obviously false, I mean, it's just not real. It's amazing. Okay, finally, obviously you're in Milwaukee tonight. You're going to be paying attention to these Republican candidates as they debate ideas. I know that the Heritage Foundation has been working on sort of preparing to have people in place come a conservative administration to execute on a bunch of this policy. How is that project going?
It's going really well. In a lot of ways, it's ahead of schedule, so much so that I think that it's causing heads of people on the left to explode. And those are the real opponents, right? Not our friends on the right. And so in particular, what has gone well is not just the building of the policies, the drafting of the executive orders, some of which will be implemented on day one, but most importantly, as Reagan would remind us, the people. We are ahead of schedule in recruiting thousands of people into this conservative LinkedIn who aren't just going to have their resumes sitting in this database, Vince. They're going to be trained. They're going to be vetted. They are going to be prepared on moment one of day one, on January 20th, 2025, regardless of who our conservative standard bearer is. Heritage doesn't have a dog in the fight. We just need the most conservative man or woman who can win the general election and is ready to reclaim this country, hire these people, so that the rest of the 2020s can be a lot more optimistic than the first half.
Yeah, and it'll put us in a great position, an even better one than we were at the beginning of 2017. There was quite a mess at the beginning of that Trump administration. A lot of that can be cleaned up by having the kind of project that you've put together here. So for that, I'm definitely grateful. In the meantime, Dr. Kevin Roberts, enjoyed this debate tonight, and we really appreciate your time today, sir.